White officer tries to remove a black woman from first class, but her husband's identity leaves him stunned. What would you do if someone judged your worth based solely on your appearance? Not your achievements, not your character, just the color of your skin. Sounds infuriating, right? But this isn't just some hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what happened to Natalie James on what was supposed to be an ordinary flight. What began as a humiliating encounter quickly escalated into a moment no one on that plane could forget. Why? Because the man attempting to strip her of her dignity had no clue who her husband was, or the storm he was about to face. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Share in the comments. If you love uplifting stories about resilience and justice, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe for more impactful tales. Your support helps us reach even more people with these powerful narratives. Now, let's jump right in. The airport was alive with its usual chaos, a symphony of noise and movement. Suitcases rolled across gleaming floors, flight announcements boomed through the terminals, and passengers hurried to make their flights. Amid this organized chaos, Natalie James made her way to Gate 12. She moved with a poise that caught people's attention, though not every look she received was warm. Dressed in a sleek white blouse and tailored slacks, she exuded confidence. Her coiled hair framed her face perfectly, and a silver bracelet sparkled on her wrist as she pulled her suitcase behind her. The line for first-class boarding was almost empty, with only a handful of passengers waiting to board. Natalie approached the gate agent, handing over her ticket. The agent glanced at her boarding pass, then smiled politely. "Enjoy your flight, Mrs. James." "Thank you," Natalie replied warmly, her tone calm yet confident. She adjusted the strap of her leather handbag and stepped onto the jet bridge. The first-class cabin was worlds apart from the bustling terminal. Plush leather seats, generous legroom, and an air of quiet luxury welcomed her. Natalie scanned the cabin until her eyes landed on her seat, 3A, a window seat near the front. As she approached, she noticed the man in the seat next to hers, 3B, an aisle seat. He was middle-aged, with broad shoulders, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt. His thinning hair barely covered his scalp, and his face seemed locked in a permanent scowl. A faint glint on his belt caught her attention. A badge. A cop, she thought, noting his body language and the way he sprawled in his seat as though he owned the space. She gave him a polite nod as she slid into her seat, but he didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he glanced at her dismissively and returned to his phone. Natalie, unfazed, settled into her seat, pulling a book from her bag. She was determined to enjoy the flight, even though she could already feel the tension in the air. A few minutes later, the flight attendant began her pre-departure rounds, offering drinks to the passengers. As she approached their row, the cop leaned toward the attendant, speaking just loud enough for Natalie to overhear. "Excuse me." What came next would set the tone for a confrontation no one could have anticipated. "But are you absolutely sure this seat is hers?" the man asked, gesturing toward Natalie with a dismissive tilt of his chin. The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yes, sir. She's seated in 3A, she replied evenly. The man chuckled dryly, a low, condescending sound that seemed to mock more than amuse. "Just wanted to make sure. You never really know these days." Natalie froze, her grip tightening on her book. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes locking onto the flight attendants. The young woman offered an apologetic smile before moving down the aisle, but the officer's words lingered in the air like a sour stench. Taking a steadying breath, Natalie reminded herself that she owed no one an explanation for being in first class. Yet, the tension in her shoulders refused to ease, even as she tried to refocus on her book. The boarding process continued, with the cabin gradually filling with other passengers. Though Natalie kept her eyes fixed on the blurred words in her book, she could feel the man's gaze flitting toward her intermittently, as though searching for another excuse to question her presence. Finally, he couldn't resist. "First class, huh?" he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must have hit the lottery or something." Natalie turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "No, I didn't. But thanks for your concern." Her measured response caught him off guard. His lips twitched, betraying a flicker of surprise, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Sure. Just seems unusual, that's all." Natalie tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and unyielding. "What's unusual?" The man leaned back in his seat, feigning nonchalance. "Oh, nothing. Forget I said anything." But Natalie didn't forget. She knew exactly what he meant. The same subtle jabs, the same thinly veiled hostility. She'd encountered it more times than she could count. Each instance was a reminder of the narrow-minded stereotypes people like him held, unable to reconcile the sight of a confident, successful black woman with their limited worldview. As the plane's engines roared to life, signaling the start of their journey, the man dropped all pretense. He flagged down the flight attendant again, this time speaking louder, his tone tinged with authority. "Ma'am, I don't think she belongs here," he said, gesturing openly at Natalie. "You need to check her ticket again. I'm pretty sure she's in the wrong section." Natalie's stomach clenched as she braced herself, her calm demeanor hiding the storm brewing inside. But she refused to let him see her falter. Carefully, Natalie placed her book down on her lap and turned to face the flight attendant, whose cheeks were now flushed with visible embarrassment. "I've already shown my ticket," Natalie said, her voice calm yet laced with unmistakable steel. "Would you like me to show it again?" The flight attendant hesitated, caught in the tension between the man's aggressive demeanor and Natalie's quiet but commanding presence. Finally, she nodded. "If you don't mind, ma'am, just to clarify." Without breaking eye contact with the cop, Natalie reached into her bag and retrieved her boarding pass. She handed it over deliberately, her movements precise, her gaze unwavering. The attendant glanced at the ticket, then returned it with a sheepish smile. "Thank you, Mrs. James. Everything's in order." But the cop wasn't finished. He leaned back in his seat, muttering just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Figures. Probably bought it with someone else's money." Natalie's hands curled into fists in her lap. She stayed silent, her calm exterior betraying none of the indignation that raged within her. A fire burned hot inside, but she refused to let this man ruin her flight, or let his actions go unanswered. Unbeknownst to him, the answer to his hostility was already on its way. The cabin hummed with a quiet anticipation as the final passengers found their seats. The flight crew moved swiftly, completing the last preparations for takeoff. Natalie sat upright, her expression calm and composed, though her heart pounded beneath her still exterior. Her fingers rested lightly on her book, trembling not with fear but with restrained anger she refused to unleash. Across the aisle the man, Officer Brad Taylor, wore a smirk of triumph. He leaned back in his seat, confident he had asserted his dominance. The faint glint of his badge under the cabin lights seemed to reinforce his air of invincibility. Natalie shifted her gaze to the window, watching the ground crew below as her thoughts churned. She had spent years navigating situations like this, mastering the art of staying composed in the face of blatant disrespect and prejudice. The world had demanded her patience at every turn, and she had learned to rise above. But this time she knew rising above wouldn't be enough. But today, something about the man's audacity gnawed at Natalie. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a stark reminder of the daily battles she and countless others faced. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're awaiting one final passenger before closing the cabin doors. Thank you for your patience." Natalie's heart lifted. She knew exactly who that final passenger was. Ethan James stepped onto the jet bridge, the confident click of his polished shoes echoing against the metal floor. His presence was undeniable, tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding respect without uttering a word. The tailored navy suit he wore fit him flawlessly, while his gold cufflinks caught the light as he casually adjusted his sleeves. Ethan was a man known for precision, in the courtroom as a federal prosecutor and in his personal life. His calm demeanor in the face of chaos, his methodical approach to challenges, these were hallmarks of his character. But now, as he approached the plane, there was a fire burning behind his piercing eyes. Moments earlier, Ethan had received a text from Natalie. Though her message was brief, it carried enough weight to quicken his steps. Asterisk, an off-duty cop is harassing me. He's trying to have me removed from my seat. Asterisk. The mere thought of someone, asterisk, anyone asterisk, daring to mistreat his wife filled him with a cold, focused anger. His stride quickened, his mind already calculating how to handle the situation effectively, without escalating it further. As Ethan entered the cabin, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Passengers fell silent, their attention drawn to him. His sharp gaze scanned the rows, quickly landing on Natalie. He offered her a brief but reassuring smile before his eyes flicked to the man seated beside her. Brad's posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before he masked it with his usual smug arrogance. Ethan walked toward them, his movements calm yet deliberate, exuding an authority that demanded attention. The flight attendant greeted him with a nervous but polite smile, clearly recognizing his composed yet commanding demeanor. "Welcome aboard, Mr. James." "Thank you," Ethan replied smoothly, his tone carrying just enough weight to draw the attention of nearby passengers. He reached Natalie's row and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of tension. Natalie looked up at him, her face softening for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though Ethan could see the exhaustion and strain in her eyes. Sensing the shift in the energy around him, Brad cleared his throat loudly. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Ethan turned his gaze to Brad, his eyes sharp and assessing, the kind of look that could strip away pretense and arrogance in an instant. "I'm her husband," he replied evenly. "And you are?" Brad smirked, leaning back in his seat as if to reclaim some semblance of dominance. "Brad Taylor, off-duty officer," he said, gesturing toward his badge. "Just trying to make sure everyone here belongs where they're supposed to." Ethan's jaw tightened ever so slightly, the only outward sign of the simmering anger he kept in check. But Ethan maintained his composure. "And what exactly made you think my wife didn't belong here, Officer Taylor?" he asked, his voice steady yet piercing. Brad shrugged, his smirk growing wider. "Just doing my job, even off the clock. Sometimes people try to sneak into places they don't belong." Ethan's voice turned colder, sharper. "Is that so?" The flight attendant, visibly uneasy, stepped forward. "Mr. James, is there an issue we need to resolve here?" Ethan offered her a polite smile before speaking loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Yes, there's an issue. This man," he gestured toward Brad, "has been harassing my wife, accusing her of not belonging in her assigned seat, even after she provided proof. And now, I'd like to know why." The flight attendant's face turned a deep shade of red. I wasn't aware," Brad interrupted, raising his voice. "Look, I was just making sure everything was in order. No harm in double-checking, right?" No harm. Ethan's voice stayed calm, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. You humiliated her in front of the entire cabin. You used your authority as an officer to intimidate her. That's not just harm, it's misconduct. For the first time, Brad's smirk faltered. Listen, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but… I'm Ethan James, he cut in, his tone as sharp as steel. Federal prosecutor. And I've dealt with men like you before. Men who hide behind a badge to justify their prejudice. A ripple of gasps echoed through the cabin, passengers exchanging stunned glances as whispers spread. Brad's face flushed an alarming shade of red, his confidence unraveling. Moments later, the captain arrived, alerted by the commotion. He listened carefully as Ethan recounted the events, his words calm but searing. By the time Ethan finished, the captain's expression was grave. "Officer Taylor," the captain said sternly, "we have zero tolerance for this kind of behavior on our flights. I'm going to have to ask you to disembark." "What?" Brad's voice cracked. "You can't do that. I'm a cop. And I'm the captain of this aircraft," the man replied firmly. "This plane isn't leaving until you're off it." Natalie watched silently as Brad's bravado crumbled, a surge of vindication washing over her. Ethan stood steady by her side, his hand still resting on her shoulder, a constant and reassuring presence as justice unfolded. The silence in the first-class cabin lingered long after Officer Brad Taylor was escorted off the plane. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some wore expressions of guilt, likely having sided with Brad earlier, their assumptions aligning with his accusations. Others had remained silent, unwilling to intervene. Now, the weight of his humiliation hung heavy in the air. Natalie stayed in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the closed cover of her book. She exhaled deeply, finally releasing the tension she'd held on to for the past hour. Ethan, standing tall beside her, scanned the cabin with a sharp, unwavering gaze that seemed to dare anyone to challenge them again. The flight attendant from earlier returned, her cheeks flushed as she approached Natalie and Ethan. She hesitated briefly, clutching a small notebook, before leaning in. "Mrs. James, Mr. James, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened earlier," she began, her voice soft but steady. "That behavior was completely unacceptable. I should have handled it better." Natalie looked up, her expression calm, yet firm. Natalie's expression remained composed but firm. "You did what you thought was best in the moment," she said gently. "I just hope this becomes a learning experience for everyone." The flight attendant nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. "Thank you for your understanding. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Ethan's gaze softened slightly. "Ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else would be a good start," he said, his tone steady but pointed. The attendant straightened, as though taking his words as a personal mission. "Absolutely. I'll make sure this incident is properly reported." Ethan finally settled into the seat beside Natalie, his movements deliberate. The quiet hum of the plane's engines filled the space between them as the flight crew finalized preparations for takeoff. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, lost in the swirl of thoughts left in the aftermath of the confrontation. "You handled that well," Natalie said softly, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and weariness. Ethan reached for her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "I don't tolerate anyone disrespecting you, Nat, especially not someone like him." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. "I didn't want to text you," she admitted, "but I knew I couldn't let him get away with it." "You did the right thing," Ethan assured her, his tone unwavering. "Men like him thrive on silence. The moment you push back, they crumble." Natalie nodded, her grip tightening around his hand. Still, it's exhausting, always having to prove I belong. Ethan's expression darkened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. I know. And it shouldn't be this way, he said firmly, but you're stronger than he could ever begin to understand. As the plane taxied down the runway, Natalie turned to the window. The golden streaks of airport lights blurred into abstract patterns as her thoughts drifted. She recalled the countless times she'd faced moments like this, subtle insults, scrutinizing stares, blatant challenges to her worth. Each one left its mark, a silent reminder of the world's unwillingness to accept her without question. Ethan, as though sensing her thoughts, spoke in a low, steady voice. You know, there's a reason men like him act the way they do, he began. They see someone like you, poised, successful, unshaken, and it terrifies them, because it reminds them of everything they'll never be. Natalie turned to him, her lips curving into a small, bittersweet smile. You always know what to say. It's the truth, he replied simply, and you need to hear it. As the plane climbed higher into the night sky, the cabin settled into a peaceful stillness, the steady hum of the engines serving as a quiet backdrop. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," a woman from a few rows back said, leaning forward slightly toward Natalie. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up earlier. What that man did was wrong, and I should have said something." Natalie looked at the woman, who appeared to be in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. She offered a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's never easy to speak up in situations like that." "But it's important," Natalie added, her voice steady. The woman nodded, her expression earnest. "It is, and I'll remember that next time." As the flight settled into its rhythm, Natalie and Ethan sat in quiet companionship, their hands still intertwined. Natalie leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her eyes heavy with fatigue but her mind restless. She thought about the passengers who had watched, judged, and stayed silent until it was too late. But she also reflected on Ethan's words, his unwavering support, and how he had dismantled the situation with a calm authority that left no room for argument. "I've been thinking," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cabin. "Maybe I should do more." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his curiosity evident. "More. To speak out," she said, her gaze distant. "To share these stories. It's not just about me. So many people go through this, and they don't have someone like you to stand up for them." Ethan's hand tightened gently around hers. "If anyone can make a difference, it's you. And I'll be with you every step of the way." A faint smile played on Natalie's lips as quiet determination began to settle over her. She had faced humiliation, but she wouldn't let it define her. Instead, she would transform it, using the experience as fuel for something greater. As the plane soared above the clouds, Natalie closed her eyes, her breathing sinking with Ethan's steady rhythm. The tension in her chest began to ease, but her resolve only grew stronger. Brad Taylor was gone, but the fight he represented wasn't over. This wasn't just her battle. It was a battle for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her determination hardened, crystallizing into purpose. This was merely one chapter in a larger story, and she was resolved to ensure the next chapter would be one of justice and change. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft glow over the first-class cabin, but within Natalie, a fire burned brighter than ever. The hum of the plane filled the silence as passengers adjusted their seats, flipped through magazines, or scrolled their phones. Despite the calm facade, the air in the cabin felt charged, as though everyone was still processing what had just unfolded. Natalie leaned back in her seat, her fingers lightly brushing against Ethan's. The tension that had consumed her earlier had dissipated, leaving behind a sense of quiet contemplation. Ethan, ever perceptive, glanced at her. "What's on your mind?" Natalie hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window where the endless expanse of sky stretched before them. "I keep thinking about him. About Brad." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of the name, his protective instincts flaring. "He's irrelevant now, Nat. He's been dealt with." She turned to him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "For now, yes. But how many others like him are still out there? How many people have been humiliated, silenced, or worse because someone like him felt untouchable?" Ethan studied her closely, his expression softening as he acknowledged the weight of her words. "Too many," he admitted quietly. "But that's why we fight," Ethan said firmly. "Why we push back. Men like Brad only hold power because too many people let them." Natalie nodded, his words striking a deep chord. Yet, even as she processed his reassurance, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. 2 rows back, a hushed conversation began to ripple through the cabin. A man in a crisp business suit leaned toward his companion, whispering animatedly. "I can't believe it," the man said, his voice low but loud enough for nearby passengers to catch snippets. "That cop, Brad Taylor, wasn't it? I've seen his name before. He's been in trouble with internal affairs." His companion, a sharp-eyed woman with a professional air, frowned. "Why wasn't he dismissed, then?" "Probably protected by his precinct," the man replied. "But if this gets out, if someone reports him again, he's finished." Natalie caught fragments of the conversation and turned slightly, her curiosity piqued. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, who had also picked up on the murmurs. Ethan leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sounds like our friend Brad has a history." "That doesn't surprise me," Natalie said sharply. "Men like him don't just wake up one day and decide to abuse their power. It's a pattern." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then maybe it's time to break that pattern." As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, thanking passengers for their patience and cooperation during boarding. The word cooperation drew a few quiet chuckles and raised eyebrows from those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Natalie noticed the glances, the way some passengers quickly looked away when her eyes met theirs. Ethan, ever the observer, leaned toward her. "They're embarrassed," he said quietly. "Good," Natalie replied, her voice firm. "Maybe next time they'll think twice about staying silent." The wheels touched down, and the plane taxied toward the gate. Natalie felt a sense of closure begin to form, but it was fleeting. As the cabin doors opened and passengers began gathering their belongings, Natalie and Ethan remained seated, letting the rush pass. They had no reason to hurry, preferring to wait for the crowd to thin. Suddenly, a murmur swept through the aisle. At the front of the plane, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions grim. They conferred briefly with the flight crew before scanning the cabin. Natalie's breath caught as she realized who they were looking for. Ethan leaned closer, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Looks like someone called ahead." The officers stopped near Natalie's row, addressing the passengers nearby. "Excuse me," one said, "did anyone witness an incident involving Officer Brad Taylor earlier on this flight?" A few hesitant hands went up, and the officers began taking statements. Ethan watched the scene unfold, his expression calm but triumphant. "Karma moves fast today," he murmured. Natalie allowed herself a small smile. "It's about time." After collecting statements, one of the officers turned to Natalie and Ethan. "Thank you for your patience. We'll be following up on this incident with the proper authorities." Ethan stood, extending a firm hand. "I'll be contacting the Department of Justice to ensure this matter is handled thoroughly." The officer nodded, clearly recognizing Ethan's authority. "Understood, sir. And thank you for standing up for what's right." Natalie rose, her posture straight and unyielding. She glanced around the cabin, catching the eyes of passengers who had avoided her gaze earlier. This time, they didn't look away. As they exited the plane, Natalie felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. But it wasn't just relief. It was a sense of purpose. She and Ethan had stood up not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or silenced. In the terminal, Ethan took her hand as they walked toward the baggage claim. The incident was behind them now, but its impact lingered. Natalie knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only a chapter in a much larger story. "You okay?" Ethan asked gently. "I am," Natalie replied, her voice steady. "More than okay. I'm ready." Ethan smiled, pride evident in his expression. "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next," she said, resolve shining through her words. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did today." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand. "And you'll make it happen. I know you will." As they stepped outside, the warm sun bathed them in light, a fitting end to a turbulent day. For Natalie, it wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something far greater, and she was ready to face it, one battle at a time. The drive home was quiet, save for the soft hum of the car's engine. Natalie stared out the window, the city lights streaking past and casting fleeting shadows over her contemplative expression. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on Natalie's leg, a silent gesture of support. The confrontation lingered in their minds, every detail replaying with vivid clarity. The tension, the injustice, the raw nerve of it all, it hadn't disappeared. It had settled into something heavier, more resolute. "Do you think he'll face consequences this time?" Natalie asked, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed but his tone unwavering. "He will. I'll make sure of it." Natalie knew too well the world they lived in. Consequences for men like Brad Taylor were often fleeting, if they came at all. The systems that protected them were intricate, built to shield rather than hold accountable. "But how far will it go?" she pressed, her voice laced with frustration. "A suspension? A slap on the wrist? I can't stop thinking about how many people like him are still out there, doing even worse." Ethan sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. "It's not enough, I know. But every small victory matters, Nat. Today wasn't just about Brad. It was about everyone watching. Everyone who saw that behavior and realized it's not acceptable." Natalie nodded, his words resonating deeply, though her heart ached with the weight of the battle ahead. "I just want it to stop. For good." By the time they reached home, the city had grown quiet. Their house, nestled in a serene neighborhood, stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Natalie stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill her lungs. The soft rustle of leaves and faint chirping of crickets grounded her, a reminder that peace was still possible. Inside, Ethan headed to the kitchen to pour them both a glass of wine, while Natalie sank into the couch. She kicked off her shoes, her body finally relaxing as the day's tension began to melt away. Ethan returned, handing her a glass before settling beside her. "You were incredible today," he said, his voice low. "I know how hard it was to stay composed." Natalie took a sip of her wine, the warmth soothing her. "I didn't feel incredible," she admitted. "I felt tired. Tired of always having to prove myself, defend myself. It's exhausting." Ethan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You shouldn't have to. But until the world changes, you'll always have me to fight beside you." A soft smile tugged at her lips, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I know. And that makes all the difference." ####. The next morning. Natalie woke early, sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. Ethan was still asleep, his breathing steady beside her. She slipped out of bed quietly, grabbing her robe before heading to the kitchen. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, she sat at the dining table and opened her laptop. The events of the previous day had solidified something within her, a determination to act. She couldn't let Brad Taylor's behavior fade into another forgotten incident. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began typing. Subject * incident report. Officer Brad Taylor. To * Department of Internal Affairs, Civil Rights Division. Body *. My name is Natalie James, and I am writing to formally report the misconduct of Officer Brad Taylor during a flight on date. As an off-duty officer, Taylor used his badge and position to harass and intimidate me, accusing me of not belonging in first class despite my valid boarding pass. His actions were not only inappropriate but emblematic of systemic abuse of power that cannot go unaddressed. The email was precise, factual, but imbued with Natalie's frustration and determination. She attached witness statements provided by the officers at the airport along with her own account of the incident. Before hitting send, she paused and took a deep breath. This was just the beginning. By the time Ethan woke and joined her, Natalie had already sent the email. She was sipping her second cup of coffee, her face set with quiet determination. "You're up early," Ethan remarked, kissing the top of her head as he passed. "I had something I needed to do," she replied simply. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Care to share?" Natalie turned her laptop toward him, showing the email she had sent. Ethan read it carefully, a proud smile spreading across his face. "You're amazing, you know that?" She shrugged, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's just a report. It might not even lead to anything." "It will," Ethan said firmly, "because you won't let it stop here. And neither will I." ####, building momentum. In the days that followed, the incident began to gain quiet traction. Word spread through legal circles and advocacy groups. Soon, Natalie received an email from a prominent civil rights organization. They wanted to amplify her story, to use it as a rallying point for greater accountability within law enforcement. At first, Natalie hesitated. She wasn't seeking fame or attention. She only wanted justice. But as she and Ethan talked it over, she realized the power of sharing her story. "This isn't just about Brad," Ethan reminded her. "It's about showing others that they can stand up too, that they don't have to accept this." With Ethan's unwavering support, Natalie agreed. She began working with the organization to draft a public statement, one that would call for systemic change while preserving her dignity and privacy. ####, a new chapter. One evening, as Natalie and Ethan sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a calm she hadn't experienced in days. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had taken the first step, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her voice. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You're making a difference, Nat. I hope you see that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "I do," she said softly. "And it's just the beginning." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Natalie closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time she felt ready to face it, one battle at a time. But for the first time in a long while, Natalie felt ready. Together, she and Ethan would face whatever came next, armed with the understanding that justice, no matter how slow, was worth pursuing. The days following Natalie's email to the Department of Internal Affairs passed with a quiet anticipation. She tried to keep her routine as normal as possible, but a part of her mind remained tethered to the incident. Would her report make a difference? Would anyone take action? Ethan, ever the steady presence, encouraged her to stay patient. Change doesn't happen overnight, he reminded her often. Natalie wasn't looking for instant change, though. She was seeking acknowledgement, accountability, and the assurance that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. It was a Wednesday morning when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Natalie was at the dining table, halfway through an article on civil rights advocacy, when the vibration startled her. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Natalie James," she said, her tone cautious but polite. "Mrs. James, this is Special Investigator Karen Moore with Internal Affairs. I'm following up on the report you filed regarding Officer Brad Taylor." Natalie's heart quickened. She carefully set her coffee cup down, trying to steady her voice. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if anyone would follow up. We take these reports very seriously," Investigator Moore replied. Her tone was professional yet empathetic. "I've reviewed the witness statements and your account. I'd like to ask a few more questions if you're available." Natalie glanced at her laptop and then at the clock. "Of course. I'm happy to help." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Investigator Moore was thorough, asking Natalie to recount the incident in detail, from Brad's initial remarks to the intervention of the flight crew and airport security. Natalie answered each question carefully, her voice steady even as the memories stirred within her. "Has Officer Taylor faced similar complaints in the past?" Natalie asked cautiously as the call drew to a close. There was a brief pause on the other end. "I can't disclose specific details at this time," Moore said carefully, "but I can tell you that your report has prompted a deeper review of his conduct." Natalie felt a flicker of hope. "I appreciate that. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about making sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." "Understood, Mrs. James," Moore replied. "We'll keep you informed as the investigation progresses. Thank you for your courage in coming forward." When the call ended, Natalie leaned back in her chair and exhaled deeply. It wasn't closure, but it was a step forward. 2 days later, an email from a journalist appeared in Natalie's inbox. The subject line read, "Request for interview regarding Officer Brad Taylor." Natalie stared at the screen, her emotions a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. The journalist, Maria Diaz, introduced herself as an investigative reporter for a major news outlet. Maria explained that Brad Taylor's name had surfaced in a broader investigation into misconduct within his precinct, and that Natalie's experience might be an important piece of the puzzle. That evening, Natalie shared the email with Ethan as they sat on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows in the room. "What do you think?" she asked, showing him the message. Ethan read it carefully, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's a double-edged sword," he said finally. "Sharing your story could amplify the impact, but it also opens you up to public scrutiny." Natalie nodded, her thoughts echoing his. "I don't want to become the face of this," she admitted. "But if it helps hold him accountable." Ethan reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Natalie's resolve hardened. "I'll do the interview, but on my terms." The interview. The meeting with Maria Diaz took place at a quiet cafe downtown. Natalie arrived early, her nerves taut but her expression composed. Maria, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, greeted her warmly and ordered coffee for both of them. "Thank you for meeting with me," Maria began, setting a small recorder on the table. I want you to know my goal here is to shine a light on systemic issues, not to sensationalize your experience. Natalie nodded, appreciating the journalist's candor. I'm here because I believe stories like mine need to be told, she said firmly. As the interview unfolded, Natalie recounted the incident with clarity, her words measured but impassioned. She spoke not just about Brad Taylor, but about the broader systemic issues that allowed men like him to abuse their power. Maria listened intently, asking thoughtful follow-up questions and ensuring Natalie felt in control of the narrative. By the end of their conversation, Natalie felt a sense of empowerment, knowing her story might contribute to something larger. That evening, Natalie and Ethan sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in days, Natalie felt a sense of calm. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had taken another step forward. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You're making a difference, Nat. I hope you see that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "I do," she said softly. "And it's just the beginning." As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Natalie closed her eyes and let the moment wash over her. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she felt ready to face it, one step at a time. "But I also need to protect my privacy and my family," Natalie said firmly. "Of course," Maria assured her. "We can anonymize parts of your story if you prefer, but your voice will be the most powerful element." For the next hour, Natalie recounted the events on the plane. Her voice was steady but carried an emotional charge that underscored the gravity of her experiences. She spoke not only about the incident with Brad Taylor, but also about the systemic challenges she had faced throughout her life, tying the episode to a larger pattern of injustice. "This isn't just about Brad Taylor," she concluded, her tone resolute. "It's about the culture that allows people like him to thrive unchecked. That's what needs to change." Maria listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook. By the end of the interview, Natalie felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and empowerment. In opening herself up, she had reclaimed her narrative. A week later, Maria's article was published under the headline, "When Power Harms, A Black Woman's Fight Against Abuse of Authority." The piece wove Natalie's experience with broader issues of systemic racism and police misconduct, supported by statistics and testimonies from others who had faced similar situations. The response was overwhelming. Emails and messages poured in from readers who related to Natalie's story, many thanking her for her courage and sharing their own experiences. Advocacy groups reached out, offering their support. Most significantly, Internal Affairs expedited its investigation into Brad Taylor, placing him on immediate suspension. The call. One evening, as Natalie and Ethan prepared dinner together, her phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed Investigator Moore's name. Natalie answered, her heart racing. "Mrs. James," Moore began, "I wanted to inform you that Officer Taylor has been formally charged with misconduct. The evidence we've gathered, including your testimony, has been critical in moving this forward." Natalie closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "Thank you for letting me know." When the call ended, Ethan pulled her into a tight embrace. "You did it," he murmured. Natalie leaned into him, her voice soft but firm. "We did it. And this is just the beginning." As they sat down to eat, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. Natalie knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The ripples of her courage had reached farther than she ever imagined, and they would continue to spread. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, Natalie found clarity in the echoes of her stand against Brad Taylor. Messages of support continued to pour in, some from strangers, others from friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Each one reminded her that her story wasn't just her own. It was part of a larger tapestry of resilience and justice. The investigation into Brad Taylor culminated in his dismissal from the police force, a decision publicly announced by his precinct. While the official statement cited repeated violations of conduct, Natalie knew it was her voice, and the voices of others, that had forced the system to act. Moving forward. One evening, Natalie and Ethan sat together on their porch, the setting sun casting warm hues across the horizon. The weight of recent weeks felt lighter, replaced by a sense of purpose. "You've made such a difference," Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. "I hope you see that." Natalie looked at him, her expression calm but determined. "I do," she said softly. "But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Natalie felt a quiet strength settle within her. Justice wasn't a single moment, it was a journey, and she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. But for Natalie, it was never about vengeance or the downfall of one man. It was about the precedent it set, the hope it ignited in those who had long felt powerless. By turning her pain into action, she had opened the door for others to do the same. One warm evening, Natalie and Ethan sat on their porch, the setting sun casting a golden glow across the horizon. The air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers, hinting at the promise of a peaceful night. "I've been thinking," Natalie said, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan turned to her, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "That's always a good thing." She chuckled softly, but her expression grew serious. "I want to do more. Not just reacting to what happens, but being proactive, educating, advocating, creating spaces where people feel empowered to speak up." Ethan nodded, pride evident in his gaze. "You've always had that in you. What's the first step?" Natalie looked out at the horizon, her eyes steady with determination. "I want to start a foundation, something that supports people who face discrimination, helps them navigate the system, and amplifies their stories. If I've learned anything, it's that our voices are our most powerful tools." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "You'll change lives, Nat. I have no doubt." Voices of Justice. A few months later, Natalie's foundation, aptly named Voices of Justice, officially launched. Its mission was clear: to provide resources, legal aid, and a platform for those fighting against discrimination and abuse of power. Natalie poured her heart into the project, using her own experience as a guiding light. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. Stories began emerging from communities across the country, testaments to the courage of individuals who refused to remain silent. Voices of Justice became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. One evening, as Natalie sat at her desk reviewing emails from people her foundation had helped, Ethan walked into the room holding 2 glasses of wine. He set one beside her and leaned against the desk, watching her with a quiet smile. "You've come a long way," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but resolute. "We've come a long way." He raised his glass. "To justice, to resilience, and to you." Natalie clinked her glass against his, the sound resonating like a quiet victory. She sipped her wine, savoring the moment and the journey that had brought her here. As the night deepened, Natalie felt a profound sense of peace. The battle she had faced was just one of many, but it had shaped her, strengthened her, and set her on a path of purpose. She had transformed her pain into power, her silence into strength, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. Natalie's courage sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond a single flight. It became a story of justice, resilience, and the extraordinary power of standing up for what's right. But this is just one story among many, and the fight for equality continues every day. If you believe in justice, if you believe in change, and if you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us for more stories that inspire, empower, and remind us of what's possible when we stand together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.